We dive into our mailbag to respond to questions about zinc isotopes, clams, the receding moon, and more. We spend the entire show this week answering the detractors in this special edition of Genesis Week. Welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy. We're going to answer questions and question answers. Proudly brought to you by the supporters of Core Ottawa, Citizens for Origins Research and Education, and now carried on the Christianema Network, Christian cinema at its finest. Some of the finest pirate broadcasting you'll see. We're transmitting from Verna's Truck Stop, where we continue to bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear, and we continue to give glory to the Creator while doing it. Remember, you can find us in cyberspace at wazulu.com, that's me, or genesisweek.com, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel and get extras like Crevo rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. Well, wait. I had the O key stick on my keyboard this week while scripting this show. I got a new keyboard, but apparently some of the original script wound up in the teleprompter files. And Joe, our dyslexic teleprompter operator, doesn't seem to have a problem with it either. And as you can see, adding letters did not increase the information in the script. I had a pile of feedback, emails, and YouTube comments sent to me the past 2 weeks from various atheists, critics, or people who genuinely believe they have evidence of evolution or an old Earth. Now, several were excellent points or questions brought up, and many of them overlapped, so I thought it would take a lot of time to address several of them. So, let's dive right into the mailbag. Woohoo! Mail for me? Ah! Yep, that's the one. East Vietnamese jumping spider. The venom is so strong that one bite can kill any child and 95% of adults. The surviving 5% typically slip into a coma for 3 to 6 months, only to wake up with permanent paralysis. Now, I should mention that this show needs to be produced many days in advance of airing, and so production starts literally a week before showtime. Thus, there can be delays of up to 2 weeks in responding to viewer feedback. But your feedback is important, and thank you for it. YouTuber Web of Science took issue with several things said in our What a Blast episode, where we talked about the zinc isotope ratios on the moon as alleged evidence of an impact origin for the moon. Now, I hope I got the order right because YouTube mixed up Web of Science's multiple postings, but here's what he wrote. Ian, I could nitpick all day with your script. For example, gravity really has very little to do with the isotopic fractionation of zinc. The primary control is the isotopic equilibrium between a silicate melt and a vapor-vapor. Heavier isotopes, as a rule, prefer silicate melt over vapor. Most of this fractionation probably occurred during the initial evaporation process, since I don't think condensation of vapor actually fractionates zinc much. But the real issue with your discussion is when you bring in water. You talk about it as if it's the nail in the coffin for the impact theory, without even touching on why people choose to study volatile proxies for water, such as zinc and chlorine isotopes. Water is very difficult to measure, this is my research, since it is highly incompatible. Magmatic processes, melting, crystallization, degassing, assimilation, etc., can rapidly affect its concentration in silicate melts and crystals. The high water contents measured in the melt inclusions in quenched interstitial melt are likely not representative of lunar magmatism, and it is very hard to reconstruct source water concentration from things like water in apatite or even melt inclusions. If you look at recent papers by groups such as Tim Groves at MIT, they come up with revised estimates of the water content of the lunar mantle far lower than the Earth's mantle, 10 parts per million compared to 180 parts per million. The great thing about zinc is that whilst its concentration may change during magmatic processes, its isotopic composition is unaffected. So it doesn't matter what processes the material you measure have been exposed to, the zinc isotope composition will always reflect the source primordial composition. And zinc is analogous to water because it has similar volatility. We would always anticipate some water zinc in the moon because of their solubilities in condensing melts at low FO2. I then asked Web of Science if they could please cite which Grove paper they mentioned, and they replied with, sure, the reference is Elkins Tanton and Grove. Water in the lunar mantle results from petrology and magma ocean modeling. But this is a highly volatile subject at the moment, and we will still have huge gaps in our understanding in the behavior of water in magmatic processes, even on Earth, let alone the moon. Thanks for writing in. You know of my fondness for bad puns and science jokes, so anyone who posts bad puns definitely has a better chance of getting their email read on the show here. I already mentioned in the previous show that there were other isotopes that had been examined from the moon rocks, such as oxygen and titanium, which did not support the impact hypothesis. Now, okay, those of you with your eyes glazed over, and for the sake of viewers who just joined and haven't got a clue what we're talking about, let's go over the history again and include the Grove research that Web of Science just mentioned. If you recall, the premise of the zinc research for moon rocks was to see if there was any lighter zinc isotopes missing, which would indicate that the zinc was vaporized by tremendous heat, which would support the theory that the moon was formed by the collision of a planet with Earth. Now, as my guests, Spike Pissaris and I, both pointed out, there was loads of water in the moon rocks from deep within the moon. Now, there are loads of more other problems with the impact theory that we could discuss, but we focused in on the water problem. How on Earth, or on the moon, could zinc be vaporized and lost, but not water? Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, and in fact it will boil at much, much lower temperatures in the vacuum of space, while zinc boils at 907 degrees Celsius. So it's pretty simple. You cannot vaporize and lose zinc from the moon without vaporizing and losing the water as well. But there's lots of water in the moon rocks. As Spike pointed out, and was reiterated by Web of Science, a 2008 paper by Sale, Hurry et al. Showed water content in the moon rocks of around 45 parts per million. Now, please note this study was based on actual physical measurements. This wasn't theory, this was fact. And even with those levels of water, Horry told the NPR, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which a giant impact melts, completely, the moon, and at the same time allows it to hold on to its water. That's a really, really difficult knot to untie. As Web of Science pointed out, Elkins, Tanton, and Grove then came out with a paper in 2011 in which they used computer models to estimate the water content of the moon. Basically, they, and other researchers, were attempting to ascribe the high water content that Sale and others kept finding as anomalous, out of place, weird. Now, based on their theories and computer models, Elkins, Tanton, and Grove concluded that the actual water content of the moon was actually only around 10 parts per million, the low end of the scale that Sale had found. Now, please notice that the Elkins-Tanton paper was based on theory, not actual measurements. Not 8 days after the Elkins-Tanton and Grove paper came out, Horry published another paper detailing further studies of the crystals from the moon, and they found out that the original numbers they published in 2008 were, in fact, wrong. The water content of the rocks was not 10 times higher than expected. It was 100 times more than expected. Please notice that Horry's research was actual measurement, not theory. This was fact, which systematically disqualified all the theories of Elkins, Tanton, and Grove, and all of the theories that others have spent years putting together to try and say that the water isn't there. Yes, while it is not the only nail, the water is most certainly a huge nail in the coffin of the impact theory. Now, if Horry could not untie this knot with 1/10 the amount of water before, are you now saying that you can untie this knot when the water content has gone up tenfold? For our next segment, let's actually revisit my interview with Spike Pissaris, where we talked about the lunar recession. Right. Okay. So now we were talking about tides. They also tell us something about, the tides do, tell us something about whether or not the Earth-Moon system can be billions of years old. Why don't you tell us about that?
on Earth, we experience the tides as the ocean rising and falling, but that's not really what's happening. What's happening is that the Earth rotates underneath the tidal bulges, and as you stand on one spot of the Earth, your location rotates into a bulge and then back out of it. The rotation of the Earth isn't shown on this video here, so the viewers will have to imagine how that works, but hopefully that's clear. Now, as the Earth spins underneath the tidal bulges, it actually drags the bulges forward slightly, because there's a little bit of friction there between the ocean floor and the water. So the bulge that faces the moon doesn't line up with the moon exactly. It's actually offset by a little bit. Now, we're talking about a large mass of ocean water here. That exerts a gravitational pull of its own that's slightly offset from the Earth's gravitational pull. So that pulls the moon slightly sideways, which accelerates the moon in its orbit. And the effect of that is that when you accelerate something in an orbit, it moves further away. So this means the moon is actually moving away from the Earth by a small distance each year.
Right.
Now, we know this is happening, and we know how much. We've actually been measuring this effect very precisely with lasers for a couple decades now. Mm-hmm. So, if you think about this, if the moon moves farther away each year, that means it used to be closer in the past. So if you do the math, it turns out that the moon would have been touching the Earth only 1.6 billion years ago. Now, I say only. That's a long time.
Yes.
I'm not saying that the Earth-Moon system is 1.6 billion years old. That's the maximum age for the system. It's not the minimum age. Now, I've come to believe that the Earth-Moon system is less than 10,000 years old, and what we see is quite consistent with that. But it's very inconsistent with the long-age view, which needs the Earth-Moon system to be 4 billion years old. 2.5 billion years older than it can be, according to what we see going on today.
Now, with regards to lunar recession, YouTuber Kiwi Frog brought up a question which I also got bombarded with by a bunch of atheists the past couple of weeks. Ian, by examining paper-thin rock layers called tidal rhythmites, Dr. Marjorie A. Chan verified how tidal records a billion years old reveal that a day at that point was 18 hours long. The theory is the Earth spun up to 3 times faster prior to the collision. As the Earth cooled and the water formed, the tidal bulge slowed the Earth as it pushed the moon away. This is similar to an ice dancer holding her arms out to slow down her spin. If we were to block the tide, the moon would no longer drift away. Thank you for writing in. Now, my first question is, how do you propose to block the tides? Blocking the tides with continents, for example, tends to increase the acceleration of the moon. Now, Kiwi Frog was only one of many this past week to bring up rhythmites. Now, what are rhythmites? Rhythmites are layers of sediment or rock which are laid down in rhythm, either daily by tides or annually, like the alleged varves we discussed last week. Normally, I don't even mention YouTube atheists because their videos tend to be filled with not just a whole lot of misinformation, but also profanity, insanity, insults, etc. Popular creation speaker Eric Hovind and I were top contenders for an award on YouTube given out by, as Eric called them, the atheist, agnostic, antichrist, God-hating YouTubers. Now, this award is given out to those creationists they deem to have broken the 9th commandment. I find it highly ironic that they would call upon the laws of a God whom they contend does not even exist. Well, Eric Hovind apparently beat me out by a few votes, and YouTuber Potholer54, who organizes the awards, once again has criticized and accused out of his own sheer ignorance. Now, I don't fault him for being ignorant. None of us is omniscient. It's the fact that he mockingly, condescendingly hurled false accusation of lies at Eric, when in fact Potholer was simply ignorant of the facts. Eric was being criticized for the very same argument Spike and I brought up, the receding moon. Potholer and a whack of other atheists, as well as the anti-creationary website, Talk Origins, all contend that the moon receding from Earth isn't a problem for deep time. Now let's look carefully what they did here. Potholer and all the other anti-creationists and naturalists understand the very real problem that the receding moon presents to the alleged old age of the moon, and have tried for years to somehow explain it away. They quickly ditched their uniformitarian assumptions. What is that? Well, look at the root word, uniform. It's the idea that present-day processes have always been the same. You know, the moon is receding now. Therefore, it would seem logical that it was always receding in the same way. Tim Thompson over the Talk Origins page claimed, of course, that in the past, the moon was receding at a slower rate, and Potholer did the same thing. Now, they have to argue this because they claim the moon to be at least 3 billion years old. But in fact, the exact opposite would happen for multiple reasons. First, there's the inverse square law. As you go back in time, the moon gets closer to Earth. As the moon gets closer, the pull of gravity on the moon gets exponentially stronger. And thus the moon picks up speed that much faster. So in complete contradiction to well-established physics, Thomson and Potholder make a special pleading. They move continents around and vary the ocean depths. Presumably Potholder was, once again, just copying from another horribly out-of-date Talk Origins page. In this case, Thomson's page, who cites a 1999 paper by Hansen in hopes that Hansen's paper can somehow save them from getting mooned too recently. Hansen took incredible creative liberties in his model. He put everything together into one continent and then put it at either the pole or at the equator, and spun the Earth so fast that a day was 12 to 18 hours long. Now, this was not based on evidence, but strictly to try and solve the lunar recession problem. And as Egbert recently pointed out, even if you make the oceans deeper, you still have a whole pile of drag on the tides, which slows down the Earth and speeds up the moon. Now, everything we can deduce about Earth's past says the moon would have receded faster in the past, not slower, as Potholder, Thomson, and many others are desperately pleading for. Now, about rhythmites. Well, Potholder claimed, we know where the moon was in the past. How do we know? Because some coastal and estuary sediments in the past, just like today, were laid down with the rhythm of the tides. So we can see how many tides there were in a year, and from coral growth and other seasonal indicators, geologists can work out how many days there were in a year, and therefore how fast the Earth was spinning. And since the period of the moon's orbit is directly linked to its orbital radius, then we can work out the distance of the moon from the Earth at various times. Notice what Potholder just did. He rejected the uniformitarian assumptions, which were based on present-day observations of the moon's recession rate, that did not support an old age he wants for the moon. He then gave a big ol' hug to uniformitarian assumptions about rhythmites, coral growth rates, and their ages, because he thinks they give him the answer he wants. Come on, Potholder. It's all or nothing. You can't accept some uniformitarian assumptions and then reject others you don't like. If you can reject them, then so can I. Potholder even cited a 1999 paper by Williams, claiming that Williams' study of rhythmites not only takes us back 2.5 billion years, he claims it shows us the moon was only 10% closer to Earth than it is today. Really? Well, isn't it interesting to note that only a few years prior, Williams actually interpreted rhythmites as being caused by the sun? And one must ask the question, how did Williams know the age of those rhythmites? Only one way. The evolutionarily assigned time scale that was assigned to those rocks. So Potholder, Thomson, and others have tossed out well-established physics and present-day observation complete with an exceptionally good understanding of exactly why the moon is receding, only to embrace an unknown past based on questionable uniformitarian assumptions and assumed ages. Now, isn't it interesting that Potholder never mentions the Mazumder paper, which came out 6 years after Williams' paper, which cites both Williams and Chan papers, and says, determination of absolute Earth-Moon distances and Earth's paleorotational parameters in the distant geological past from tidal rhythmite, however, is ambiguous because of the difficulties in determining the absolute length of the ancient lunar sidereal month. And he closes the article with, the calculated absolute Earth-Moon distances and Earth's paleorotational parameters in the distant geologic past are highly speculative. Translation? We can't tell the moon's distance nor the Earth's spin in the past based on rhythmites because we can't figure out how long a month was back then. And if we gave you some numbers, they'd be nothing more than a wild guess. You would think Potholder, Thomson, and others would have learned their lesson from the failed uniformitarian assumptions of the past. In his Talk Origins article, Thomson claims he has learned this lesson, criticizes creationists for making uniformitarian assumptions, and then hypocritically wades in way over his head in uniformitarian assumptions, calling upon rhythmites as proof of a past lower recession rate for the moon. Are you dizzy yet from all the circular reasoning and hypocrisy? Well, bear with me. Last week, we discussed the alleged annual layers of ice cores and varves. Well, rhythmites also have some surprises. Rhythmites look like they represent thousands of years can form in a single day. Now, my fellow creationary researchers who only write, get off mercifully. I'm on television, so I have to pronounce the Icelandic word Jökulrup, which is a catastrophic breach of an ice dam on a glacier. A dramatic Jökulrup broke forth near Grímsvötn, Iceland, on November 5th, 1996. This sudden catastrophic dumping of a glacial lake produced 200 planar rhythmites in under 17 hours. Now, this was one very small, very turbulent flow of water on a very small part of a very small island. Obviously, then, a global flood can produce rhythmites on a huge scale, literally worldwide, in a very short time. So Eric Hovind is not a liar, nor is the Earth-Moon system billions of years old. When one actually looks at the evidence, logically, it all indicates that the Moon is far, far too young for the evolutionary timescale. But there is no conflict with the biblical timescale. Any attempt to explain away the evidence involves wild guesses, outlandish speculations, and special pleading, and hypocrisy of the highest order. Critics being ignorant of the facts does not make Eric a liar.
Funny, fast, and furious. Ian's Crevo rants cover a multitude of topics in an easy-to-understand comical way. Complicated subjects that normally make your brain hurt a lot less when Ian explains them, while wearing his anti-government mind-reading equipment. Have questions about carbon-14 dating, natural selection, thermodynamics, or what on earth is he doing there? 3 volumes of rants on DVD. Take your pick for $15 each, plus shipping and handling, or order all 3 as a package and save yourself $10. Order online today at Ian's Bookstore.
Another atheist YouTuber, Bod2Bit, posted a video in response to my Crevo rant number 78, where I talked about genetic entropy. Bod claims to have found an example of a beneficial mutation. He brought up a fascinating creature called the Lampsilus mussel. Now, this clam, as well as several others, have a feature that looks remarkably like a minnow, which attracts fish to aid in its reproduction. Bod pointed to a video available on YouTube from an unknown documentary, which claims that this fish lure attracts only a specific type of bass. Now, when the bass goes to eat the fake minnow, the clam releases its baby clams called glochidia, which then attach to the fish's gills where it lives as a parasite off the fish's blood for a time, then drops off to the river floor later on. Bod2Bits emphasized his point in a comment left on YouTube. No, what I said was that it exists only because predation exists. So either you must claim that God created it that way, i.e. in a context where predation exists, or it has evolved, call it what you want, into its present form, in which case you need to show how that change does not represent new information. Now, it's interesting because the exact same footage and example was used by Dr. Joe Martin in his phenomenal video series, Incredible Creatures That Defy Evolution. Dr. Martin, a former evolutionist himself, actually uses this very clam as an example of incredible creation, not evolution. Bod2Bits and the producers of the documentary made several bold and unfounded assumptions in their attempt to promote evolutionary thinking. For example, they assume that predation is the real reason for the fish lure. They apparently never considered any other possibilities. In fact, in the documentary, they show a second Lampsilus with a different lure, point out that it's different than the others, and then claim it is unsuccessful in attracting fish. Wait a minute. According then to your unfounded speculations, that clam shouldn't even be there. Obviously, both Bod and the documentary producers are flat out wrong in their assumptions. Lures attracting fish are not necessarily just to attract predators. For example, it could simply be attracting fish of the same kind it was presenting, attracting schools of the same fish, or other fish that are just plain curious. It is well known that the clam can just release its glochidia into the water where, by chance, fish breathing will suck in the glochidia, which attach to the gills. But also notice what the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources has to say about the glochidia. Once the glochidia are expelled from the female's gills, they attach to fish gills or fins by clamping onto them with their valves. So even a fish or a school of fish coming near the clam, or just simply touching the fish lure, can have the glochidia attached to them. There is no predator activity necessary. As for parasitic relationships, again, these can actually be symbiotic relationships. A symbiotic relationship is where two different organisms live or thrive because of each other. These symbiotic relationships have also been harmed in the corruption of the world, and thus we may not even recognize them as symbiotic. For example, it's now known that intestinal worms in humans can stave off asthma. The worms actually seem to have a beneficial effect on the human immune system. So parasitic relationships are not necessarily bad or one way only, but perhaps contain a symbiosis to them we didn't even know about. So the Lampsillus clam does not demand evolution nor predation and is an excellent example of incredible design. And finally, we got an email from one more atheist who wrote in from Newfoundland. Hey Ian, I just wanted to let you know how much I appreciate wonderful people like yourself who are out there spreading the creation message. A few years ago, I was an atheist who believed in the evolutionary account for creation, and then I stumbled across your complete creation series on YouTube. Everything you had to say made me question my entire belief system. I began a long and intensive journey to find the truth, and after some time, and more time spent studying than high school and college combined, I concluded that evolution must be false, and there is definitely something to this creation message. Since then, I have continued my research and had my own personal encounter with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I am saved and born again along with my wife and our 3 children, and are being brought up in the life that they were meant to be brought up in. Please don't stop doing what you are doing. The world needs people like you to defend our faith against the scary and dangerous faith that is evolution. God bless. Look forward to watching more of your videos in your weekly episode of Genesis Week. Your friend in Christ, Kevin Young. Thanks for writing in, Kevin, and thanks for the kind words. Okay, we're out of time. I'm your host, Ian Juby. I hope you'll join me again next Genesis Week. Remember, you can send in your comments, questions, proprietary industrial secrets to comments at genesisweek.com, or you can send us a tweet at genesisweek, or you can go to our YouTube channel at genesisweek.com, find the latest show, and leave a comment there. Remember those words of our Creator, the Lord Jesus Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. See you next week.
We need your support to help keep this program on the air. You can help by making a tax-deductible donation to Core Ottawa, Canada North Post Office Box 72075, Ottawa, Ontario, K2K2P4. You can also sign up for Ian's newsletter detailing current research and news items at ianjuby.org.